Hello folks, I played last night at the Worcester Chess Club in the second round of the Mellow March Open, and I had the white pieces against Rawl Rutter, rated 1686. I led with d4, he played e6, and after c4 he played f5, which transposes into the Dutch defense. And I have very little experience against the Dutch when gotten to with this move order, so I just made some moves that looked logical to me. Knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, and he played bishop to b4. I decided to put the question to this bishop and ask black what he intends to do with it by playing queen b3. And this makes it so that if he captures on c3, I can take back with the queen, avoiding the damaging of the queenside pawn structure. He did take, I took back, and I expected here that he'd play c5, and thought maybe we'd get the variation d takes c5, knight e4, queen c2, queen a5 check, bishop d2, knight takes d2, when I was curious about queen takes d2, queen takes d2, king takes d2, which gets us into a queenless middle game. I don't claim that it's advantageous for white, but I just thought it'd be interesting to play. Instead he played b6, looking to fianchetto his queenside bishop on the a8, h1 diagonal, of course. I played g3 with the plan to oppose that bishop there. Bishop b7, bishop g2, he castled, I castled, and he played d6. I threw my b-pawn out to b4. I'd like to develop this dark squared bishop somewhere, but I couldn't find anywhere good immediately to do so on the c1, h6 diagonal. If I bring it to g5, it'll probably get kicked at some point with h6, and I don't really have any other good squares. I don't really want it on d2 because that'll block what might otherwise be my partial control of the d file with a rook. So I thought b4, and I could put it on b2 to put some more pressure on the long diagonal, or maybe there would be a variation in which this bishop heads out to a3 and controls some other dark squares. But after Rawl played queen e7, I decided against bishop to b2, and that's because I was worried that at some point black would play f4, looking for counterplay, and that move would be more effective if I didn't have my dark squared bishop attacking that square. So I played bishop to g5 instead, pinning the knight to the queen, and fully prepared to capture on f6 with my bishop should black play h6. Rawl played knight bd7, guarding his knight on f6 and developing his last minor piece, which makes a lot of sense. And I played c5 right away. I don't really know why I played this immediately. It just looked appealing to me, so I tried to make it work. I rely on my subconscious a lot in chess to make value judgments about moves, and sometimes I'm not really able to justify those moves after the fact. But I might have been worried about the fact that black could play e5 at some point, challenging me in the center. So I wanted to make my break before he made his. But of course it'd be much better to make this c5 pawn break with my rooks involved in the game. But I played c5, and I wanted to threaten c6, of course. And I was looking a lot at what would happen if he played c6 or he moved one of his minor pieces, but didn't calculate at all what would happen if he simply captured a bunch of times on c5. B takes c5, b takes c5, d takes c5, d takes c5, and then something takes c5. But in my post-move attempt to justify my position, I decided that here I would end up with play on the C and B files against the c7 pawn and this loose bishop on b7. But after b takes c5, b takes c5, Rawl played bishop to d5. I backed up my pawn on c5 so that I'm no longer losing it. Didn't do so with the a rook, because why give up the pawn on a2, although maybe I wouldn't have been hanging that pawn because there might have been tactics along this long light square diagonal. Rook f to c1. Rawl played d takes c5, I played d takes c5, and he played c6, anchoring the bishop on d5. And here I thought I would be emerging from the complications with an advantage if I played knight e5. But the way things worked out, I don't think that was really the case. He played bishop to g2, I took back, he took on e5, I took back, and the white pieces look much more impressive to me here than the black ones. But after Rawl's queen f7, unpinning, I realized that I really didn't want this black knight to show up on the d5 and e4 squares, when the only way for me to get rid of it is to play f3 and e4, which would allow a trade of f-pawns, which would expose my king on the f-file. So I decided just to capture on f6, and expected that he would recapture with the queen. But he took back with his g-pawn. I think taking back with the queen was better, and if I go queen d6, maybe black can play e5 right away. If I then play rook d1, perhaps there's rook f to d8, and maybe black is holding things together here, at least. I think he is. So I think I would have taken on f6 had he recaptured with the queen. And now black can either accept a little bit of a damaged pawn structure, or he can put his rook on the 6th rank, which will be awkward if he ends up having to retreat it and move it over to the d-file or the b-file, but might be okay because black may just be able to play e5 at some point soon. I think this would have been a better defense. But after bishop takes f6, Rawl played g takes f6, and now I get to play queen d6, attacking the pawn on c6. So black has to defend that. He does so with his f-rook. And I played rook to d1, looking to take control of the d-file so that there's never rook d8. Well, there could be rook d8, but I'd at least have the option there of trading my queen for 2 rooks. Rawl played rook to c7, and I played rook a to b1, activating my last piece. And why not control both files, of course, if you can? And now I came up with the idea of going a4, a5, a6 to control the b7 square better, so that at some point in the future maybe I can place a rook there, and maybe removing that rook for black will mean bringing one of my pawns to the 7th rank. Rawl played king g7, I played a4, and he stopped me from advancing my pawn, but the downside of doing that is that if this black pawn moves up somewhere, black no longer has control of the b6 square. And after a5 I played rook b6, hitting the pawn on c6. And I think at this point black is losing a pawn. If he had tried rook a to c8 here, I could have played rook a6, and then if he had played rook a7, which looks like it holds everything together. Actually, no, it doesn't, because I can just play rook takes c6. But I also have rook takes a7, queen takes a7, queen takes e6. And there's no time for queen takes c5 because of queen takes c8. So he played king g6. I'm not sure where he was going with the king. I guess he was just getting it off of the back 2 ranks so that there weren't any tactics that pinned his queen to his king, for example. I played rook takes c6. Rawl played rook a7. And I had to decide whether or not to trade here on c7, of course. And I figured that I should, because after rook takes c7, if the queen takes back, perhaps I can start grabbing pawns with queen takes e6, which would probably be pretty good. I mean, that would cost me the pawn on c5. But my pieces would be getting very close to his king, and there might be like a queen g8 check or a queen e8 check, or the movement of the rook to the back rank followed by a rook check in order to win the game. He took back with the rook, though, and in this position, I figured that c6 would give white a really good, by that I mean winning position. The white king was a little bit exposed on the long diagonal, but isn't anymore, thanks to the presence of the pawn on c6. And it's going to be hard for black to improve the position of his pieces without allowing either an attack on his king or the queening of the c-pawn. Rawl played rook a7, and I got a little bit fancy here. Maybe I should have played queen d8, intending rook d7, when if there's a capture on that square one way or another, I end up with my pawn getting closer to being promoted. But I played queen d7 instead. Sometimes these fancy moves are a little bit too appealing to me. And the idea, of course, is that after rook takes d7, c takes d7, black will have to trade his queen for the pawn on d7. The same thing happens, by the way, after queen takes d7. Black will either have to play rook takes d7 or rook a8 and rook takes d8. And so I expected that he'd make some other move here, and I thought maybe rook c7 is what he'd play. And I reasoned that queen d8 was a good move here, and the way I justified the playing of queen d7 to begin with was by saying to myself that if we get to this position, I'm now covering his rook again, which makes it so that after black plays e5, the queen can't go anywhere. Let's just highlight a square, because that will lose the rook on c7. But I think instead here he could have made some other move, let's say e5, opening up the queen a little bit. And I can't play c7 here because there's just rook takes c7. So I think I'd have had to play queen d8 anyway, which means I gave black this improving move e5 for free. So I probably should have played queen d8 to begin with. But after queen d7, Rawl resigned. Alright, so I'm at 2 out of 2 at that tournament. The next game will be next Thursday, and I will bring you that when I have it. I will be going to Cambridge tomorrow with Mike Stevens, so hopefully we'll do well there, and I will put those games on the internet afterwards. Thanks a lot.